Can you hear me okay? I'm trying to stay out.
Oh, hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Is Taryn represented today?
Yeah, Katie's here.
Hi, Katie. You can?
Yeah, hi, Eric Wojcik here, thanks.
Eric, PG&E?
Hey, Arnold, this is Ken. Vincent and I are on the line for PG&E.
Great, thank you. SoCal Edison?
Hello, Edison's on the line.
Thank you. Sempra?
Yes, we're present.
Thank you. And level 4, I think I saw William earlier. And is there any other party that I've missed? Okay, great. Oh. Someone want to say something? Okay. So let's move on. I do want to thank everybody for participating today and in all of the previous technical working groups and the previous workshop. I know it's been a lot of work happening in rapid succession. So I do appreciate the time you guys have made for this effort. CJ, can you flip to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is today's agenda. And we schedule time from 10 until 4 p.m. I don't think we're gonna need all of that time, but we'll see. We'll stay flexible. So if we get through a particular recommendation fairly quickly, we'll move ahead and get to the next one and so forth, so on and so forth. If we have extra time and we need to discuss previous topics in more detail, or you want to provide more feedback on them, as the day goes on, we can always try to make time and take that bit of feedback as well. But we are going to start with the adoption of a cost-benefit approach in the RDF at 10:15. We'll take a break at 11:15. Discuss the valuation of the safety attribute at 11:30. Take lunch from 12 to 1. Discuss the valuation of electric reliability and gas reliability from 1 until 2. Then we'll take a break at 2:15, and then finally wrap up with the environmental and social justice impact recommendations at 3. Oh, and I just wanted to ask if people can mute themselves right now. Next slide, please, CJ. Okay, so I did want to discuss some of the upcoming dates and milestones. Next slide. So obviously today we're having workshop number 2, where we're at least presenting to you, to the parties, all of our initial recommendations. July, there is a lengthy sort of review process internally. So throughout July, that'll be happening until August 4th. Roughly speaking, we think we'll be able to issue a staff proposal via ruling at that time. And of course, the rest of August will be taken up by comment period. And then the ALJ will do the write-up through September and into October. And then we expect that late October that there will be a proposed decision issued via ruling. And then, of course, into November, there's a comment period. And then finally, final decision and commission voting meeting will occur in December. And okay, so that's just a brief look ahead at some of the milestones. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to discuss purpose and expected outcome. So today, obviously, we'll present with initial draft set of phase 2 staff proposal recommendations. The recommendations are based on the culmination of 1 prior workshop and 4 prior TWGs, as I've mentioned, in order to investigate revisions to the current RDF approach. Staff will carefully collect and consider oral feedback from parties during workshop 2 for further consideration towards the staff proposal recommendations. So I do want to stress that it's important to provide your feedback today if you can, orally, but you do recognize that you may have additional thoughts or would prefer to put something in writing. But given how fast we need to submit a staff proposal, we're asking that if you do have any written comments to provide them by the close of this Friday, which is July 1st. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll quickly get into the first recommendation, and that's the cost-benefit approach as RDF. Next slide. So the scoping memo issue that we are addressing in not only this recommendation, but the monetization recommendations that will follow is should the commission consider revising or refining the RDF methodology for valuing services, mitigations, and/or impacts such as those related to reliability and safety? If so, should the commission consider A, defining and requiring use of a consistent value of statistical life, B, whether the dollar value of attributes should be explicitly addressed, and C I won't read because we actually haven't discussed it in these previous TWGs in phase 2, so I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you all know, the MAVF attempts to combine multiple attributes into a single metric to quantify the consequences of the risk event, and that's the current MAVF approach. We have noticed that there are a couple of disadvantages have emerged after adoption. So we've seen instances of limited understandability within the components, particularly with weights and ranges. And the commission itself has made the mistake of applying that 40% minimum criterion on the safety attribute, which is not really how weights are or should be interpreted in the MAVF structure. And then that leads into the metrics that come from the MAVF analysis and the RDF, which is the risk score, the mitigation risk reduction score, and the risk spend efficiency. And there's a lot of misunderstanding or just not enough knowledge about what those metrics represent or what they mean. In fact, it's not particularly intuitive. And what that results in is a lack of transparency because of the lack of understanding of those metrics. And on top of that, there's a limited usability when you present an RSC score, which is nice to tell you whether a mitigation or what the risk reduction looks per dollar and relative to other RSCs, but it's hard to use in terms of deciding whether a benefit outweighs the costs. So that ratio would need to be converted into a cost-benefit ratio, which is something that Turn has done in the WMP analysis in order to make it usable as a decision-making tool in the GRC. Next slide. So level 4 recommended or made a recommendation in order to sort of get at this scoping memo issue. And I'll just read it here. And they've labeled it MAVF2. With input from the parties involved, the CPUC should adopt a standard set of parameters and formulas to monetize risk consequences using standard values from other government agencies or industry sources where possible. And when we've asked for informal written comments about the recommendations in general, there was a general consensus that we should pursue monetization and that we should monetize some of these attributes. And then on May 20th, we facilitated a TWG number 2 that centered on developing details for the MAVF2 recommendation. Next slide, please. And so again, one party presented a set of made their case clear for why they opposed the cost-benefit approach and favored the MAV approach. And I've listed them out here. I'm not going to get into them because I think all of us were present at the TWG, but you can always, if you do want me to go over them again, I can. But I'll just read off the 7 different reasons that were stated in that meeting. There was a misunderstanding about the role of weights and ranges in the current MAVF structure. There was a monetization. We would need to monetize all additional and future attributes if we were to go the route of cost-benefit approach. There's a loss of transparency in the cost-benefit approach. Sorry, these are what was argued against the approach. This is not necessarily the case. There's a potential discomfort with placing a dollar value on human life. There are potential trade-offs would no longer be explicit. There's difficulty in ascertaining monetary value for all attributes. And monetization could restrict flexibility. These were the arguments made in opposition to the cost-benefit approach. Next slide, please. So ultimately, staff, we took all of those comments into consideration, and we, as well as comments from PG&E, from Level 4, and other parties regarding those arguments against the cost-benefit approach, and we considered the benefits of the cost-benefit approach. And we ultimately decided that we want IOUs to implement the dollar valuation of the attributes in a cost-benefit structure going forward. And that would ultimately mean replacing the current MAVF scheme and revising the RDF. So the shift to a cost-benefit approach that places a monetary value on attributes is pretty much, as I mentioned, is actually happening in a lot of ways. Turn already, one of the main criticisms they make of PG&E's MAVF is that the implied VSL is too high. So they already use an implied value of VSL as a check on reasonableness, and so obviously that means that they monetize that attribute in some ways. And then Turn is also in the latest WMP filing on PG&E's WMP derived the cost-benefit ratio from the MAVF RSC data. Next slide, please. So staff expects that the monetization of attributes in the RDF will create a greater degree of understandability and usefulness in the decision-making process, and that's something I've mentioned earlier in an earlier slide. But the monetized trade-off for one, for each attribute replaces the current weight and range for each attribute in the MAV approach, thereby simplifying the RDF, and it creates less confusion about what weight actually means. It's not some relative meaning of importance, or it's not this like idea of importance. It's implicit when you can compare dollars, and I think it's intuitive as well. Second reason, the move away from explicit weighting would prevent regulators, practitioners, and other stakeholders from being constrained by the 40% minimum weighting of the safety attribute, which I guess I already stated this, but it's a misunderstanding of weights as a reflection of general importance. Third reason, the representation of risk and risk reduction in dollars and the cost-benefit ratio expressed by the dollar reduction in risk versus dollar expended is intuitively more understandable and arguably more useful than the representation of risk found in the current MAVF scheme, which is referenced to the RSC mostly. Expressing risk in dollars ultimately eliminates the need for a standard readability factor, which we discussed in the previous TWG. But we wouldn't need one if we're going to compare the cost-benefit value in dollars and come up with a ratio. Next slide, please. So some of the things that were addressed in TWG number 2 as arguments against the cost-benefit analysis, I'm just going to state why we actually don't expect that to happen. We don't expect a loss of transparency. All inputs are expected to be clear and explicit and expressed in natural units. The only meaningful difference should be the numerical representation of combined risk attribute consequences. As I've stated, we're looking at dollars now instead of risk scores and risk reduction scores and ORC values. Staff will allow flexibility in the valuation of attributes. So we intend to allow each IOU to use an attribute standard and value that makes the most sense for the IOU, as long as it can offer a detailed explanation. In fact, we were intending to try to come up with a process for providing something of an, for lack of a better word, something of an exemption that would allow an IOU to use as a value that veers from one that's recommended by staff and parties. But we weren't able to do so before this point in the process. And then staff expects that continuous discussions with the TWG and new studies, publications, and methodologies will continue to provide a range of up-to-date and acceptable dollar values to represent each attribute. Next slide, please. And I just want to remind everyone that this is not the end of the process, these phase 2 recommendations. We know there's still a lot of work to be done, and some of the immediate next steps I've listed here. We still need to address risk attitude in the RDF, and we also need to develop a formal process for authorizing an exception. I should have said exception, not exemption, and that'll be discussed in phase 3 of this proceeding as well. And staff will continue to facilitate TWG sessions into phase 3 of this proceeding. That will continue to improve upon the cost-benefit approach and valuations determined for each attribute. So with that, I think, CJ, is there another slide related to this proposal? Okay, can you flip back? Yeah, so that's the basic summary of our recommendation for the cost-benefit approach. I want to open it up for feedback to the group. I see that, sorry, I'm having a hard time seeing who's raised their hands, but does anyone want to provide?
Arnold, this is Russell Archer from Edison. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I have my hand raised, and I apologize if others do too, and I'm cutting the line, but I can't see any other hands. So I'll start. Thank you for the recommendation and the ability to comment on it. So just at a high level, I'm not sure that we agree that there's sort of a broad general consensus that this is the right approach. I also wonder if it's appropriate to sort of unilaterally change a very closely and heavily negotiated settlement agreement that led to the current framework based on the recommendation of a particular party as opposed to the consensus that emerges when a settlement agreement is finalized. So that's my initial reaction. From a procedural standpoint, we'd like a little bit more time, please, if possible, to file our informal comments. I know at the beginning of your presentation, you said you'd like them by close of business on Friday. We have an all-day workshop tomorrow in our ramp, in SCE's ramp, so that turnaround would be very difficult. So if we could be afforded maybe even an extra 3 or 4 days, it would be very, very helpful for us. And then finally, and I'll just preview this now and you'll see more of it in our written comments. As you know, we're currently litigating our ramp proceeding, which was, our ramp was filed and constructed based on the existing framework, and that will inform our 2025 GRC. And it's not reasonably feasible for us to have a ramp to GRC integration if the rules change in the middle of the game. So I would just request that if the rules do change, and this is a pretty serious change, that they would be applied prospectively only. And by prospectively, I mean not for Edison's 2025 GRC, which we've already begun preliminarily getting ready for, as well as the upcoming WMPs. The schedule calls for a decision in December, and as we know, the commission schedules often slip with the commission, and so being able to incorporate that any changes into a WMP that files, in early February, and especially a GRC that will be under final development by that point, is not practical for us. So thank you for considering those issues.
Thank you, Russell. Jordan, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah. First off, I guess on the SE, we also would like an extension. Just 2 days, is really tight turnaround for us. We would like to file written informal comments on this, particularly because, the cost benefit approach is a bit outside the scope of our previous TWG discussions where we were talking about monetizations and MAVF. So we really want time to understand and review those details. And you pointed to a couple of those details, which I think are critical as we consider this, which was allowing flexibility and evaluation of attributes. And then one that was noted as an immediate next step is risk attitude still needs to be addressed. We think that we need to understand that piece in the context of cost benefit approach as we're putting together our written responses.
Thank you, Jordan.
Can I respond real quick to Russell's comment about prospective application of the rules, Arnold?
Yes, please.
Hey, Russell, it's Ben from SPD. Yeah, that's the intent. We don't plan on changing rules on anybody like midstream. Like we're thinking about this would take this decision, if we're successful on this timeline, would be made in December, and it wouldn't apply till probably PG&E's ramp filing.
Okay, Ben, thank you so much for that clarification. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is Vincent speaking. I had my hand raised. No objections. I'll go ahead. Kind of similar comments to what Jordan had mentioned. What we're proposing, what I'm seeing in this proposal, is a kind of an intermediate step towards a kind of bigger end goal, and I'm also similarly concerned that without this addressing this risk attitude issue, the BC ratios that we will develop are just going to be in some ways not usable. So I'm just trying to understand a little bit about how the SPD sees us as we progress through these steps, right? So what's the implementation of these proposals? And once again, I think the risk attitude talk is really crucial, because without that, I think the BC ratios that we develop will in some sense will actually be incorrect.
Vincent, hey, I also see a hand up from Sam Savage.
Hey, I'd like to, I don't want to address Vincent's question directly. I want to make sure we do get to that. I was going to discuss sort of a way to transition here, but I think Vincent asked a very important question. And Max, are you available to talk about risk attitude? I mean, risk attitude is obviously going to be layered on top of everything we do. We must take preferences into account, regardless. But Max, do you want to address that at all?
Sure. I mean, I certainly recognize this is an important question. I think I mentioned in the earlier meeting, there is a argument that says that for public policy applications of decision analysis and cost-benefit analysis, where the outcomes are sort of, well, they may be horrific and disastrous in terms of, individual instances. If you're looking at them as a, say, percentage increment on fatalities for the state as a whole, it's, obviously a very small percentage. And that from the public policy point of view, that one could appropriately use risk neutrality. Now, obviously, from an individual utility point of view, they may have a very different attitude, and there's some question about which risk preference, which risk attitude is appropriate to put in here. And I certainly don't want to prejudge that discussion.
And I'd like to continue this discussion as well. I don't think that the monetization rules out in any way, a risk attitude. One of the things, for example, is, if you have the risk of a circuit failing and you monetize that, right? But then you have the potential of 10 circuits failing. It's going to be very different if they all fail at once and black out Los Angeles, or if they fail independently. So I think the risk attitude, and I believe we felt this for a while, should sort of be moved to the portfolio level. but I don't see any issue, Vincent. I think you should continue, Vincent, with like a specific example where risk, attitude has got to be adopted, at the granular level, which it certainly has to be part of this process.
Right. I guess I'd also like to check in with the utilities. My sense is that at this point, PG&E is the only one that still has nonlinear scaling functions. Is that accurate?
We still have a nonlinear scaling function. I cannot speak for
Yeah.
my counterparts, but PG&E still has its nonlinear functions.
Yes, I know PG&E does, but I think, am I right in thinking that the other utilities present have in fact gone to a linear, basically have removed a sort of specific risk aversion or risk attitude?
I can confirm from SCE that is correct.
But I mean, I think that risk attitude is an independent concept from monetization, really, because we must address what is the dollar value of this kind of event not happening.
Right.
And you could have a very, very nonlinear function depending on whether you black out a whole city or you black out one transformer.
Yes. So it's certainly possible to, I think I presented that in one of my slides, to put in a risk attitude, risk aversion, let's say, within the cost benefit framework, and you would apply it after you've computed total cost or total benefit from a risk reduction.
So, Simon, Max, just a couple of thoughts.
Yep.
Sam, I was just referring to, I understand your arguments. I was just mentioning that kind of from a practical basis, right? So I do feel that this is an intermediate step. Seems like you feel this is like a step to getting us to where we want to go. We still need to have a risk attitude discussion. But let's say, we have only this intermediate step by the time our ramp comes up, then I'm concerned that, we could be showing something that is not fully developed yet. You see what I mean? So
yes, I quite agree. I mean, this issue
absolutely.
should be resolved.
And I do have. No, please go ahead.
I wanted to point out about the risk neutral argument that you mentioned, Max. I think we've been looking at it recently. We kind of feel that on a federal level, that might even not be the case to be risk neutral, because I think the feds have a policy whereby before you even talk about benefit cost analysis, you need to make sure that you get to a level of risk that's safe and acceptable first, right? So we were just looking at this, and I think it goes back to a Supreme Court decision in 1980 that established that. So I think even at the Fed level, there's no agreement that you should be risk neutral as well. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. I want to mention one other thing, that the current MAVF has enough parameters in it. So I think we should, maybe level 4 should think about this a little bit. Is there some straightforward way to take the current MAVF and just say, using these monetization levels, it just translates into this? Like, I mean, just a simple function in a spreadsheet might take you from one to the other, right? But all the arguments sort of against that this is less transparent, I think it's just the other way around. With the current thing, there were all these, the fewest people that could be killed is this many, and the most people who could get killed is that. I mean, all kinds of imponderable ranges on things. I thought that was quite untransparent, but we should, I would think, algorithmically, I just want us to think about this, get from the current one to the new one, and we would learn about the consistency of the old approach that way as well. If two different old MAVFs, that probably should have given the same answer, give very different monetization answers, that would tell you there was sort of an inconsistency there. But that also might make it easier for people to transition. That might be part of the transition, that here's a formula that sort of takes you from the old one to the new one, but people are going to have to agree on the monetization anyway. I think that whole procedure, I don't know how that would move forward, but if we agreed on a set of monetizations, then it would just seem to me you'd have a spreadsheet formula that could take you from the old one to the new one. Your thoughts on that, Max?
Yeah, that would be definitely possible to do. But I mean, the difference here in terms of the risk attitude is that right now there's a potentially nonlinear scaling function on each attribute individually. So there's potentially 3 different nonlinear scaling functions. And if you want to put, I mean, you could still do that in a cost-benefit framework, but it would be far more natural to go to a single nonlinear scaling function, single risk attitude function that you apply to the total monetized cost or benefit, and usually benefit since we're talking about risk reduction for our mitigations, and apply it there. So it does simplify things in that you only need one risk attitude function, if any.
Yeah.
But
So, I mean, those are the kind of things, nice. I think you're elaborating on some of the concerns we have, right? We need to have these discussions first. And if we're just left with this proposal before our ramp comes along, you know, I think it's not a good place for us, because anything that we develop is going to look,
sure,
maybe people not going to agree with it. You know, it's like, so it's kind of crucial. That's why I'm really thinking about how it gets implemented.
yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
Let's turn to William, Chris Parks, and then Jordan.
So just to kind of a few things. First of all, the idea of this particular set of this particular proposal is that this would be the direction that we would be moving to. And then Vincent's exactly right. There's still a lot of work to be done to flesh out the details of how this would be how this would work in practice, what those different formulas and values and so on would be. And clearly that work would have to be done prior to the IOUs being able to apply this and actually use it. So we would have to make sure that we have a directional agreement at this point in time. Then we have a lot of work to do to flesh out the details. And then once that work is done, then we can look at a transition end strategy like Ben was talking about for, you know, which filings do we have the work done on time to impact, and where is it realistic to do that? I also think that there's a little bit of using risk attitude loosely to mean a couple different things. Risk attitude formally, what we would be talking about is generally is the attitude towards the magnitude of the risk or the magnitude of the dollar amount at risk. And so that's where Max is talking about for most public policy decisions and within a reasonable range, as Vincent was talking about, it's normally linear. But separate from that, we have what the monetized value should be for a risk event expressed in its natural units. So whether that's customer minutes interrupted, or whether that's a value of statistical life, or of an injury, or of CO2 emissions. And so when we're defining that, the formula for doing that monetization can be quite sophisticated. It can have nonlinear components. It can have step functions, you know, based on after one day it's higher than whatever. So you can make that really as sophisticated as you need it to be in order to properly capture the risk relative to other risks. Another point here is that I think people often get confused with this monetization thing, thinking that the dollars that we're capturing are the actual dollars at risk, I guess I would say. So, for example, if we have an injury, what's the actual cost of the injury to, or if we have a loss of life, what's the actual accrued value, that earnings potential of that life, or whatever. but I think that the monetization goes well beyond that. For example, if we look at the monetized cost of a ton of carbon emissions, well, it's pretty much impossible to say what's the true cost of that carbon emission. You can try to come up with something, but it's pretty much impossible to come up with an actual number of what's the incremental impact to all the different people of breathing in or the climate warming or whatever.
So William, on that point, there are many people who would disagree with you. There are estimates of the social cost of carbon, and indeed ones adopted by federal agencies. There's certainly
yes, but those are
that argue that that's appropriate. Other people say that's an oversimplification, but
those are not. But those were they did not. They cannot. Some of these things you cannot realistically come up with accurate numbers using a bottom-up approach of what's the incremental cost on each person in the world and the unborn babies or whatever. Realistically, people agree on a number. They get together, they use the best analysis that they can, and they ultimately agree that this is the number we're going to use, and that relative to other risks, or in this case, everything's always relative, because whenever we are spending money to mitigate a risk, we're also causing rates to go up. And so there's always a trade-off, at least that there's a trade-off. So really our goal here is to make sure that the monetization is keeping the risks proportionate across to each other, and so that we're spending the money in the appropriate way and on the appropriate mitigations relative to other mitigations. Sometimes that'll be a clear-cut dollar amount that we can point to a bottom-up approach to deriving it, which the ICE calculators tries to do, through surveys and so on. And sometimes it'll be just an agreed to amount that seems right. That's really all I had.
Sam, did you want to respond to William?
Yeah, I wanted to say, first of all, I thought William's response was really terrific on this, and that from a philosophical standpoint, again, so he mentioned all those nonlinearities. From a philosophical standpoint, we all feel at level 4 that if we can improve the standardization, that is, get 80% of it standardized, then the whole regulatory procedure gets streamlined and we can spend our time on the remaining 20%. So I think William got 80% of it. And that's the philosophy we need to take here. And without getting exactly the cost of the carbon pollution, we've got it in the equation. It helps keep us on track. We do not ignore that, as we will not ignore social costs. And the goal is to streamline the procedure by making as much as we can standardized. That's, I think, the philosophy behind it. Not that this will be perfect and you'll press a button and the entire utility industry of California will be optimized.
Chris Parks, did you have a comment or feedback? If not.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I did, but I don't, I can hold it for a little bit if it would. I don't want to sidetrack the current discussion if you want me to hang on for a moment.
Yeah, let me see. I think Vincent may have a comment related to this conversation.
Yeah, I think the fact that we're having this conversation kind of shows that the whole talk about benefit cost ratio is just beginning. This is not the end of that conversation about it. This is just the start of it, and I'm concerned that with the proposal that we have here, because I firmly believe that it shouldn't happen. That some are seen as an endorsement of what we have seen to date in the areas of benefit cost analysis. And I feel that like I said, some of the work we've seen in that area, it's just not developed enough for us to be there. So that's one concern that I have. And I'd like to hear what SPP's thoughts on that as well.
Thanks, Vincent. Chris, do you want to go ahead with your comment?
Sure. Yeah, so this was a comment, I mean, earlier, just to tag on to, I think what others were saying at the very beginning of the meeting was the schedule. You know, the presentation today is about the staff, in advance of the staff proposal. And then there was discussion about follow-up comments. And some folks were suggesting more time, and we would agree with that. And in fact, if we could propose July 15th, because just a few days probably won't actually help us that much. So we would actually request July 15th to do follow-up comments after we have time to kind of like learn from this workshop and digest it and come up with some responses. And then if we could go to, so that's one, I have maybe 3 or 4 things, but if we could go to slide 14 for a moment. So here it talks about all inputs, the first bullet here, all inputs are to be clear and explicit and expressed in natural units. You know, just to highlight one of the things that we were recommending in the previous technical working groups is to have a minimum set of guidelines for a minimum set of inputs. And if that could be part of the staff proposal, I think there would be a lot of value in that. For example, we've discussed several times now, or a couple of times, the need to have claims data for evaluating PSPS risk to understand the real impacts of outages on customers. And we've discussed, I believe, having a minimum set of what would be considered. In fact, actually, I just got a survey, I think it was from PG&E this last week, asking how power outages would impact me. And I thought, oh, that's actually a really positive thing to really understand how folks are impacted by outages so that they can then prioritize mitigations of PSPS, or now PG&E has EPSS, to be able to prioritize mitigations that are the best bang for the buck in terms of mitigations in the ramp and then in the follow-up of the GRCs. And then if we could go back to slide 4 for a moment, that's the timeline slide, please. So, and some of this relates to the discussion that I've been hearing, but one of the things that we suggested earlier was to have a test run or test cases of the new approach that comes out of this. And it sounds like staff have identified opportunities to really improve the ramp process. And so if there were an opportunity with, you know, this shows opening comments, reply comments, maybe there could be an adjustment to the final schedule so that after the reply comments at the end of August, that there could be a opportunity for staff to put out sort of like the final staff proposal or something like that. And then to take that and if utilities could then use that to do a test case, and maybe they would select what would be the most easiest one to do with the most relevant and probably one of the highest priority ones to do, to go through and take that through the actual process, all the way from the risk evaluation through the analysis, a ramp, and then what that comes out with in the general rate case programs. One of the things that we've expressed before is we don't have clarity on how this process actually ends up in driving, like, is the utility proposing to harden 200 miles in year X, 300 miles in year Y? What kind of hardening of the circuit are they going to do? Why is that the best use of funds? And then justify that in the general rate case programs. my experience from looking at the ramps is that the utilities kind of like, okay, we have to put this information out there. We have to do this. We have to show what our RSE is. Now there's going to be the monetization of risk, but there's still this gap in understanding how that actually comes up with the very specific number of miles or levels of mitigation, scope, pace, everything else that's in the general rate case. And in my mind, that's the intent of the ramp, is to be able to justify why 500 miles, why not 2,000 miles, because of the urgency of the mitigation. And so if there were an opportunity in between 829 and the next step to actually do test run cases and have utilities provide that, that might then affect the overall schedule, probably would, and perhaps it would be appropriate for a motion to extend the schedule and a request if others felt similarly. Anyway, that's one of the key things that I think would need to happen, is to actually show how the academic discussion that I'm hearing today actually translates into specific mitigation programs in the general rate case. So I'll just end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Jordan still has his hands up. To ask a question or raise a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate a comment that was made earlier by Russell regarding, I think it's on slide number 10, where it said general consensus, pursue cost-benefit approach. We weren't fully aligned with that, and we're kind of wondering if you could elaborate on that. And then the other point about the considerations for the previous negotiated settlement agreement, and really kind of how this all plays into that. So we were really wanting more clarity on that.
Sure. So the general consensus comment comes from the comments that were submitted on May 10th by all parties regarding the various recommendations made by level 4. And the recommendation you see on this slide at the very top, MAVF2, was one that saw general support, except explicitly from TURN. So there might have been one or two IOUs that I'm pretty sure all parties commented actually on this in support of it. So yeah, that's what I mean by general consensus, and it's specific to the informal written comments provided on May 10th regarding level 4's recommendations. As far as the settlement agreement goes, my understanding is that what we are intending to do with the post-benefit approach is maintain many of the same elements that MAVF requires. So I don't have it offhand, but if you look at the step 1 portion of the settlement agreement, that ultimately feeds into the current RDF. There's a nod towards developing and constructing the MAVF. There's specific elements within that that are still going to be maintained, but elements that are no longer applicable specific to an MAVF will be essentially part of the post-benefit approach, revised approach. So you still have to still develop primary attributes. You will still have to consider the consequences, but ultimately, instead of boiling everything down into a risk score, you're essentially monetizing those consequences.
All right, thank you for the clarification.
Dr. Eric Wojcik has a question in the chat box that I'd like to read out.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Eric. You could just ask it.
No, you can use that. I just want to also say that for some reason I can't raise my hand because I'm using the phone. My earphones won't connect to your audio. So
okay. Yeah, I think if you want, you can just jump in, I guess, at any point, really.
Okay, thanks.
Makes this easier, yeah. So Eric Wojcik has a question in the chat box. How would cost-benefit ratio and risk attitude relate to RSC? Is this too obvious? And someone...
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, I think the cost-benefit ratio is a good idea, but we have not discussed how it sort of cascades through to the other pieces of the mechanism. And I think Chris was alluding to those things as well, maybe not directly, but how do we make sure that we translate this to RSE and to investment recommendations?
Thank you, Eric. Well, I'll just answer from my understanding is RSC is a tool that allows you to compare relative risk spend efficiencies across different mitigations and programs, but it doesn't really allow decision makers on our end or even for stakeholders to really evaluate the benefit in relation to the cost, right? So like the CB ratio, you're essentially monetizing what the benefit that you're receiving from a particular mitigation, and then obviously compared against its cost. That ratio will allow you to understand, like, are you getting more benefit out of than expense, or is it less? Is the benefit, is the dollar benefit less than the cost that you incur? So that helps ratepayers make decisions. That helps regulators make decisions about whether a mitigation is worth it. Essentially, RC apparently doesn't have the same sort of benefit. As far as I can tell, it's hard to actually relate that to actual actionable decision making, and several stakeholders in the GRC have made that comment. So I don't want to speak for Turner, I apologize, but I think in the comments, they've also stated that RC isn't as useful as a tool as a cost benefit ratio, and they in fact have converted the RC into a cost benefit ratio in the WMP process.
Well, thank you. I don't know if I can just add a little bit to that. I'm also concerned that the cost benefit ratio may be viewed as something we should use in a particular circumstance because it's so obvious, and that you would diminish or not even consider the RC as you get to the GRC recommendation for an investment category in a tranche. So even talking about those trade-offs, because obviously you're going to say one criteria is better for a set of reasons, then obviously we're distorting our whole approach here and diminishing the use of RC in that case. Okay, fine, but we should discuss it. How is this going to work? Are there examples? We're going to a San Diego Gas Electric general rate case pretty quick. What are we going to do?
Sam, do you want to?
Aren't these? I mean, these things are. If you can get from one to the other with a simple mathematical expression, then I don't think they're very different. I mean, is the first thing. I mean, measuring in inches or measuring in feet or measuring in centimeters, you can quickly get back and forth. But I wanted to say something else, which is that whatever way you try to make your system efficient, it'll be different if you do it at the portfolio level than at the individual level. And I want to make sure we always have that in the back of our mind. At this point, we're trying to establish building blocks, really, with which we can smoothly look at things at the individual asset level or at the portfolio level, because those, regardless of which of these measures you use, could be quite different. And I do understand people's reluctance to, well, I don't want to see our discussion suddenly turn into mandated procedures that people have to follow before we work out all the details. And I mean, I think that's why we've all agreed there's going to be quite a long time scale here. But I mean, I guess I don't see, if I see cost benefit or risk spend efficiency, I mean, those I can quickly get from one to the other, can I not? Are they not, they both have to do with dollars and with some kind of benefit.
Let's go to Vincent, William, and then Katie.
I actually just had a quick response to Sam. I don't have the details of it, but I believe in because I am not the attorney covering the WMP, but I believe in that case, Turn did determine that there was a fairly easy or fairly straight, I don't want to say easy, fairly straightforward translation from the RSU to the cost benefit analysis. So that would be a place to look for that discussion.
But Katie, that would mean you could just pick one or the other and then just convert everything to the other, it would seem to me, right? If we chose to do that.
I don't feel empowered. I don't know that I can answer that question right now because I haven't.
Someone could. If someone did, then we could stop discussing this issue, right?
I just
Yeah,
wanted to.
yes, Eric, that's what I'm trying to figure out. So thanks.
I just wanted to mention to Sam and also a bit about the benefit cost ratio that was derived by Turn in our WMP. We do have some issues with that, so we will be addressing those. But yeah, the more kind of point. Well, so I feel it's a bit premature to look at that work solely. The other thing I wanted to mention that Sam talked about having a mathematical formula to make all this kind of consistent. I think there are other approaches to do that. Earlier, I talked about, how on a federal level, they first ask the question is, do we have an acceptable level of risk? And they kind of take a two-step test, right? First is like, let's get everything down to something that's acceptable. And then once it's acceptable, then we can then they start looking at the benefit cost ratios. So I think that's another approach that we should consider. It's not purely mathematical, but at the same time, it's very appealing because it's a very intuitive way to think about the problem. It's like, can we even live with this risk first? And if the answer is no, we just need to do whatever we can in our power to alleviate it first, and then we start looking at the margins.
I like Vincent. That's the ALARP approach that Steve Hain discussed years ago, and I very much like that idea too. It's kind of a nice graphical approach to whether you've passed this test or not. But I don't think anything we're doing precludes that at all. And I don't know if Steve Hain is on, but there's something called ALARP, where basically some things are just off the table in terms of being too risky, right? And what it does do, I think, is probably cuts down or draws your attention to urgent hazards in a way that you don't even have to be terribly analytical if everyone agrees. Well, I don't want to go too far down that path, but I think it is also a useful way to look at it, Vincent, and that if you haven't seen it, the term is ALARP, which means as, I don't know, low as reasonably practicable or something like that.
Yeah, I have seen it.
Yeah.
And I think I might be wrong, but when I looked at the 2016 decision, it talked about basically this framework, kind of the one we have right now is a step towards moving towards a ALARP framework, right? I think so.
Vincent, I'm sorry, I want to jump in to reply to that. This is Steve Hain here. Yes, the cost benefit ratio is a step in that direction, the ALARP framework direction, but to have a full ALARP framework direction, the commission would need to define a cost benefit ratio standard, as well as defining upper and lower bound risk tolerance limits. So yes, there would be one component towards that framework. The cost benefit ratio would be one component towards that framework.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Steve. Thanks for clarifying.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. William, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So, well, first, a real brief thing. Katie talked about going from the MAVF to a cost benefit ratio through a formula. I suspect that that's a one-way translation where you can go from MAVF to a cost benefit number, but not, I don't know that you can go back the other direction.
William, that was an RSE. That was an RSE to.
Oh, from an RSE coming out of the MAVF.
No. From CB to RSE, from cost
Okay.
benefit to RSE. I think that's a two-way street.
I don't know if you can go from, I don't know if you can go from cost benefit back to the existing RSE numbers. I think you can go the other direction, but I don't know that you can reverse engineer the existing numbers.
You mean based on the MAVF?
Yes, exactly.
No. I'm assuming the RSE already means we're using a monetization framework and everything.
Yeah.
No. I don't think you can go back. No.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
In terms of RSE, risk spend efficiency, I think we've been talking about it as a three-legged stool kind of an approach. So one of the legs of that is the cost benefit ratio. And we recognize that we haven't really talked about that so much this session, but we have to, that has to be time adjusted. So it's a time adjusted cost benefit, factoring in time. The second component is because we're looking at risk spend efficiency at the portfolio level rather than the individual risk item level, we have to have, as Sam talked about, we have to factor in dependencies because we're looking at the with dependencies, what's the portfolio level risk optimization. And the third thing that we talked about a couple sessions ago, but we haven't mentioned here is the third leg of the stool is sensitivity analysis. So once we've done the portfolio level dependence adjusted cost benefit optimization, then we want to say, and what variables where there's a fairly high degree of uncertainty about that variable would cause the risk spend to change significantly. We want to understand that. So those three components are what we would see as having an efficient risk spend process. Thanks.
William, this is Eric. Thank you for that. That's what I was looking for. I will say, though, in my analysis of cost benefit analysis, you always do those three things anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to figure out the scope. You're trying to figure out whether it's portfolio level, get the time adjustment right, do sensitivity analysis. And so it should be both ways.
Any other comments? Okay, so let's at this point let's take a short break. We'll take, it was originally scheduled for 11:15 for 15 minutes. Let's say let's go into 11:25, and then we'll all come back. Thank you. Oops. Okay, hello everybody. Coming back from break, I guess we should do another roll call just to make sure everybody's here. See, level 4 is here. Is Turn here?
Turn is here.
Thank you, Katie. You can. I see Eric. Okay, Joe Mitchell, is that right?
I'm here.
Thank you. Chris Parks.
Yes, here.
Thank you. PG&E. Oh, I'm sorry, and Belinda Dickinson.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. PG&E.
Present.
We're here, Arnold. Thank you.
SoCal Edison.
Yes, we're here.
Sempra.
Present.
Any other group make their way onto this call? Okay. So we will begin. CJ Patel is going to be our next presenter, and I will turn it over to him.
Right. Thanks, Arnold. Hello, everyone. I'm CJ Patel, and I'm going to talk about the valuation of the safety attribute. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit of background. Monetization of safety consequences addresses scoping memo issue number 2. One issue with using the current MAVF is that it has produced unreasonable safety consequence implied values in the ramp filings. So when SPD staff and parties involved back calculate through the MAVF, we get that IOUs are using a VSL of about 100 million, and that's about 10 times the order of magnitude of what government agencies are recommending to use in present day. So high implied VSL can make certain mitigations appear more favorable if they reduce the inflated value of the safety attribute. As mentioned previously, level 4's MAVF2 recommendation states with input from parties involved, the CPUC should adopt a standard set of parameters / formulas to monetize risk consequences. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the discussion we've had previously. PG&E supports adopting a range of VSLs and stated that comparison to dollars was already occurring. PG&E emphasized should a VSL be adopted, it should be reasonable, transparent as to how it was derived. SCE posted consideration for valuing serious injuries along a gradient in the VSL and how to model values without going back to the MAVF. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so here's our recommendation. Staff recommends monetizing safety consequences using value statistical life VSL. Staff recommends using DOT guidance on VSL, which is 11.8 million for 2021. DOT has an equation which computes the present day VSL value using changes in inflation and income, and I've presented that equation below. So we'll dive more into the components of that on the next slide. Thank you. So staff recommends using price index data and median usual weekly earnings from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the price index data is the P parameter in this equation, and then the income is going to be the I, and I've listed the source links below right there. Another component is the income elasticity. So based on DOT guidance, staff recommends using 1.0. And then the next component is the range. So staff recommends IOUs use a range of VSLs adopted by the US HHS. So the high and low estimates derived from HHS for the base year 2021 are 5.5 and 17.9 million. Next slide. Staff recommends using DOT guidance on how to apply VSL to injuries based on the severity level. So table 1 below has 6 different severity levels, and they correlate to a fraction of the VSL to be used to value how that injury prevention occurs. So the last 2 bullet points are just why we selected these sources. So DOT was selected because they provide an equation to account for changes in income and inflation, and also several parties recommended DOT. HHS was used because they provide a range of high and low estimates, and that was also something that parties wanted, is a range of flexibility. So that's all I have for my section. It's pretty brief and straightforward.
Vincent, and then Sam.
There's a question on this table here, because you know, in our analysis we have fatalities and serious injuries, right? And we have a conversion from fatalities to serious. We have a conversion from one to the other, right? One serious injury is worth a quarter of a fatality. Are you suggesting with this table that we move towards using to modeling all these different kinds of severity?
That's the current suggestion. We're open to feedback and criticism, but yeah, that's what's proposed presently.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is that, you know, I'm not sure that we have the data to support these 7 levels of or 6 levels of severities for our events. So you know, I'm not sure if we're trying to get a level of accuracy or level of precision, we might not be able to get there.
Yeah, so thank you for that. That was actually one of our concerns, and so I appreciate you bringing that up.
This is.
Go ahead, Sam, and then Dan.
Yeah, no. So certainly, I certainly see that as a problem. I mean, you know, if someone hits their thumb with a hammer and, you know, causes a sore thumb, keeping track of how your safety procedures are going to reduce that might be hard. And I do think from the data standpoint, you could have a big problem going down to this level. But when you say minor, moderate, serious, I mean, in legal cases, there are precedents, aren't there, for losing a finger, losing a hand, losing an arm? I mean, I think probably they're pretty well established things. Not that you could run that back through an RSE calculation by trying to calculate how many fingers you were going to save. I mean, I do think that would be absolutely nuts, and that you may very well want to just break it into 2 categories: fatalities and injuries. But I'm just interested in this table, what this goes back to. How are these defined? Minor, moderate, serious, and so on.
Yeah, so that's something I haven't specifically looked into. I kind of pulled it from DOT directly, so I haven't looked at their references.
And I just, Vincent, were you on the call last week with OEIS where someone said, this is a quote, I forget who it was, "You can always go to finer granularity if you want to mislead yourself in greater detail."
I wasn't at the call, but I certainly agree with that. And I think one of the things is, for example, you know, my colleagues are telling me that PHMSA doesn't even track injuries at this level of granularity. So, you know, it's definitely a concern for us.
Yeah, and this is Dan from SCE. I just kind of want to maybe echo Vincent's comments. So like, I know, and I need to follow up with our, you know, Edison safety teams here is, you know, we use the Edison Electric Institute's safety classification learning model, which classifies It has very specific criteria for what they consider to be a serious injury, and there are 14 of them. I think one of them is a lost limb and certain things. I don't know how that would necessarily map to these severities without knowing kind of the formal definitions, but I know at least that's what our safety performance metrics reports have kind of adopted as a metric for how we're going forward. So I know that there are very specific definitions that at least the IOUs use at least for that metric reporting. And I know internally that's what we use as the EEI SCL. I just don't know if we can get this specific, and then obviously I think, as Sam may have mentioned, like doing a backcast, if we had to look at historical data, that might be difficult to look back at each description of every incident and then reclassify. Potentially going forward, that might be easier. But once again, I think just having an idea of what those definitions are would help us determine whether or not we have the ability to get to that level of granularity, or if we just maybe choose one of those buckets, like the MAIS for severe is most equivalent to what we would use for EEI SCL or something of that nature.
Just quickly, IOUs have been treating, if we just look at it as a fatality versus a serious injury. Serious injuries have been valued at about a quarter of a fatality. Is that correct? Or am I just misremembering that?
Right,
Yes.
1/4.
Okay, thank you. Dan, and then Sam. Oh, and then Joe.
I'll lower my hand.
Okay, then let's go to Sam and then Joe.
Yeah, and it's sort of a question for Vincent as well. So if we think, let's go to gas pipeline safety, which I am familiar with, and there just are not a lot of events, right? They're horrible when they happen. San Bruno is terrible, but you don't have tons of statistics. And I've often wondered, and Vincent, maybe you can opine on this, if we did not look at ruptures that resulted in fatalities, but we use sort of loss of containment events as a surrogate and looked at some mathematical model of the likelihood of failure given a loss of containment event, that gives us a lot more statistics to look at, right? Even though it's fewer injuries, but maybe this is really a question for you. Does this sound like a sensible approach to look, instead of looking at actual fatalities that have occurred per event, we look at a class of events that are likely to create fatalities and extrapolate from that?
I don't know enough of the area right now. I would need to consider it as something.
Okay.
Comment at this point.
Let's forget that conversation then.
Let's move to Joseph Mitchell.
Must Grade Road Alliance. I think this adds some value, this recommendation, particularly if it isn't obligatory. If you look at the current way that fatalities and severe injuries are handled, that would be just MAIS 6 and 4. Basically, everything would fall into those two categories. If you're not requiring that everybody divide all risk into the micro categories you have here, you allow them to put in these categories if they're needed. So for instance, having read a bit on smoke morbidities and so forth, there's a whole range of smoke morbidities that you could get from wildfire smoke, from an asthma attack requiring a hospitalization stay, heart attack, all the way from actual fatalities all the way down to fairly impactful but less impactful. And a scale like this would allow actual data to be mapped on to be given VSL levels, whereas trying to figure out how to shoehorn all the rest of that information into, well, was it severe? Is the hospital stay overnight a serious injury? Or how do we define serious injury? Is a heart attack serious? and fatalities, which are, pretty clear. So if it's not obligatory, if this is an option, then it allows a level of granularity if it's needed and well understood. Thanks.
Any other comments? Fred?
I appreciate Dr. Mitchell's comment. It occurs to me that you could have situations where there were a large number of, say, moderate injuries, but if we only had the two category system, none of that would be accountable for in somebody's risk. So it could be that if there's an event that's expected to produce a large number of moderate injuries, that this kind of a table would allow accounting for that and would bring up the benefit of a mitigation that's aimed at reducing that. Whereas if you only counted something as being a severe injury or a fatality, then you're missing out on the opportunity to identify and mitigate what could be a very serious risk just based on the number. If thousands of people are getting moderate injuries, that's probably something we'd like to pay attention to. I also appreciate the notion that that this kind of a table would be allowed but not required.
This is Eric Wojcik. Can you hear me? Yeah. So thank you. I appreciate the discussion. I guess I'm wondering how we take any particular accident risk issue, such as when a backhoe operator cuts open a transmission line or distribution line, gas line. Where does that fall? I mean, how many people are affected at each category? And to me, that's the sort of first basis, and the point that was made earlier. Got to have data. Where are we rich with data? How do we develop the data or use the data that we have so that we can really make this more robust and direct? So in that sense, we could use this, but we need the data. So where's the data would be the question to me. Thanks.
Let's go to William and then Sam.
I think going back to what Joe was saying for the minor and the moderate injuries, where I could see that being particularly useful is in the wildfire mitigation situation. And in those cases, I think that the wildfire models do have data for the number of people that would be directly impacted by severe smoke. And I know that there's data that's been published about the incidence of that on asthma and other respiratory diseases, on heart attacks and so on. So I think that in the wildfire area anyway, that data is available and could be used if desired.
Sam and then Vincent.
Yeah, so I wouldn't expect any of the IOUs to have enough data on their own. Let's just go to pipeline rupture, right? Or loss of containment, you see, which is the first step. We've got, serious gas leak somewhere. But we have a whole world of gas pipes. I mean, all over the world with gas accidents. It seems to me we're entitled, if a pipe blows up in Siberia or wherever, depending on the occupancy count around the pipe, there must be ways to use all that data, and it seems to me we should be entitled to. In fact, we should go look for that data and not just rely on our own local data.
Vincent, and then Dan.
On a kind of slightly unrelated question, if you go back one slide, if we can go back up one slide. Oh, okay. See this question here. I believe in the, I think middle term of the equation basically is adjustment for inflation. Get that? So I'm just wondering what the thoughts are on how to look at the forward values for the VSL, right? Do we have to inflate the VSLs when we're looking at the forward values and all these other monetary attributes? What's the thought about that?
Sam, do you want to respond?
What do you mean by forward values?
Right. Let's say, for example, we established a VSL for 2022 as, I'm just making up a number here, 18 million for 2022. And then, when we look at our analysis, right, when we're doing analysis about the future benefits of these programs, do we assume that VSL, that the program might be, help to cut down the risk of fatalities by 3 lives or something, and, we have to extend those benefits out through time, right? So I'm just wondering, when we do that, do we need to adjust the VSL for the benefits in 2023, 24, 25, 26, so on and so forth?
So I think if we use DOT, that's not really possible because they don't have price index data for the future. I think for this case, we would have to select a base year for whatever, if it's a GRC or a ramp, and then just stick with that. I don't know if that makes sense.
This has been real quick. You get I don't think we anticipate saying you have to use this exact number. This is supposed to be a sort of this is what we'd recommend using, and then if a utility has a better idea about how to evaluate life in a reasonable way, it's this is sort of this is what we recommend. But if you for example, if PG&E was to say, hey, we've added this inflation estimator or whatever for future years for the value of reducing or mortality avoided or whatever the appropriate term is, that'd be okay. You just have to justify it in a transparent way.
Got it.
Well,
Hand up from Sam.
Yeah, go ahead. Am I next?
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Okay, yeah, but I think Vincent raised an extremely important point here, that we know that we discount money, right? That's what net present value is about, right? $1 a year for 1 million years is not worth $1 million, but we have to look at the benefits in the same way. And I don't think this point can be taken lightly. When our team read through this stuff, that was one of the things we were concerned about, is a consistent way to measure benefits in the future. And so I think that the questions that Vincent raises are serious, and we do have to devote some attention to this. This is just one place where it would show up, is the value of life in the future. But
it'll show up in all the monetized attributes.
Yeah, it's going to show up in everything. And so it's just this isn't going away.
Steve, and then William.
Yeah, I just have a question for anybody, not necessarily for SPD staff. In the latest SE RAM, they use a different discount rate for benefits and dollar values. Now, my question is, once you convert everything into dollars, does that necessarily imply that it makes no sense to have different discount rates for the numerator and the denominator? Level 4, or anybody can answer that.
I was just gonna, this goes directly to what I was just gonna say, when we're talking about these discounting future dollars, and this is one example of that, by going to a monetization approach, what we would normally do is we would discount all of the dollars, and normally we can use the same number to do that discounting. So we would normally not use a different discount factor for each variable. We would not use a different discount factor for the benefits versus the costs. Normally we can do all of our calculations and then apply that discount on an annual basis to the net costs and the net benefits over time. So it's really not that complicated, in other words. It just involves predominantly allowing for inflation over time.
Steve, this is Eric Wojcik on discount rates. So I'll play the economist and say that it's not, just as was said, it's not typically that you use a different discount rate for benefits versus costs. You may use a different discount rate for different perspectives. If you have a utility perspective versus a customer perspective, or versus a societal perspective. But here we're not using those points of differentiation.
Thank you.
So I mean, I think while we're having this discussion, it kind of, I hate to say it again, but it kind of highlights, it's like when it comes times for PG ramp, right? We sincerely hope we have more guidance by the time that ramp happens, because I think otherwise we'll be discussing in the ramp. I'm not sure it's a good place to do that. You know what I mean? So. I think a follow-up. I mean, I'll be more explicit. I think that right now, the decision is as it stands. I mean, we'll still need to go back and consider the proposal here. But as it stands, it seems a bit incomplete, and so we would get an incomplete ramp. If it's applied to the ramp, our ramp will be incomplete, and the results of that, hard to say. But that's where we stand.
Yeah, thank you, Vincent. Our intention is that this proposal is not the end of the process. And it may be that we have to insert some very careful wording in what we're proposing to make it clear that that what the commission adopts is not a standalone final end to the development of RDF, if that makes sense to you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, are there any other comments from the group? If not, why don't we take our lunch break here and all meet back at 1 p.m. sharp. Thank you guys for your participation this meeting.
Thanks, Arnold.
Where they took the Calambaro screen and then they did a subset of it. And let me see if I have the parameters in front of me. I may still have it. But it's like there's a percentage of let's see if I have it. 1 second. Actually, I don't have that one open. But it's a subset of Calambaro screen that's particularly disadvantaged. So yeah, so that in that decision, it has some criteria that that SE has used to make a map of disadvantaged and vulnerable communities in their territory, and so we're envisioning something along those lines.
Okay, our analyst who's more familiar with this CDC social vulnerability indexes is not on this workshop. But what I can do is I can get more information, and then I guess in follow-up comments to this workshop, we can maybe share some information on that. Thanks.
Sounds good. Yeah, so it's here, I just found it. It's all census tracts with 25% highest scoring on Calenvaro screen, census tracts with a median household income of less than 60% of the state median income, census tracts that score in the highest 5% of pollution burden within Calenvaro screen, and all tribal lands is what the climate vulnerability proceeding has as disadvantaged and vulnerable communities.
Okay, I think that the CDC one may get into vulnerability related to like, you know, so if we're talking about vulnerability, for example, PSPS risk, if we're talking about PSPS risk, one of the concerns might be, or outage risk might be the ability to evacuate. And so that might also weigh in, like, I think this index captures, you know, folks' data in terms of like households, whether they have vehicles, as well as income and other things, I think. But I'm not too familiar with it, so I think probably best thing would be if we just kind of do our try and do a little more, and we can follow up in the comments afterwards on that.
Sounds good. Thanks, Chris. And certainly we can, you know, put some meat on the bones in phase 3 of this proceeding too. So we can start out fairly simple and then, you know, progress from there.
Brian has his hand up. Go ahead, Brian.
You might be double muted, Brian.
This is Dan from SCE. We can incorporate Brian's comments into our informal comments.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Any other comments about this recommendation? Okay. And Brian can also, if you are trying to speak and you get that figured out, we can always return to that comment in this towards the end of the presentations.
Hey guys, can you hear me now?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hey, I just wanted to respond, and Chris, thanks for those comments. I just wanted to give you some more context. So I think the NRDCI, the CDC sort of calculator has different attributes, and there are different weights to that. So it may give you different outcomes. In terms of PSPS, in the PSPS OII, we've been required to look at certain attributes from access and functional needs customers and non-residential critical infrastructure customers, which may not be captured in these other indices. So just wanted to make you aware of that. And then finally, regarding egress, I also looked at the CDC sort of factors to sort of mock up what an egress model would look like. But Edison has already proposed a different egress model that more appropriately models population to road ratios in our latest WMP and RAMP filings. So just wanted to make you aware of that context.
Thanks, Brian. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, I believe, and I was trying to find it in real time here, that there are different factors. And I pulled up, in fact, It's called California Wildfire Social Vulnerability Risk. And then looking at it, I could share the screen, but I can send the link afterwards, but it talks about ranking it in terms of very high social vulnerability, moderate to high social vulnerability, moderate social vulnerability, low, and then low, low to moderate, and then low. And it's got it all kind of locationally color coded. And so that's with wildfire. In some ways, I think outage and wildfire risk groups may overlap to some degree. And so, but anyway,
Yeah, I would say one caution against that though.
Mhm.
So a lot of these calculators has a lag in the data. So they may have the pre-mitigated baseline for wildfire risk. So in a lot of places, we've already deployed a lot of mitigation. So I just be cautious with some of the lags in some of those calculators.
So that's an important point. If it's pre-mitigated, the value I think in it that it's locationally based as far as I can tell. So it might pinpoint the most socially risk, the vulnerability risk from very specific areas. And in that way, it would make sense that a risk assessment in terms of targeting mitigations could use this data. And yeah, if it's already been mitigated and the utility would know that, then that one would already be resolved or mitigated. But it seems like it has a great deal of granularity in terms of being able to target those most vulnerable to maybe both wildfire and outage or PSPS or other types of outage risks.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one last comment I'll make on ESJ in particular. One challenge, and a lot of people have brought this up with Kellen virus screen, is it's more designed towards pollution mitigation and not necessarily natural hazard mitigation. So if you look at the weightings of the populations there, it's things like exposure to, transportation emissions and things like that. So I just be cautious about how much this may be sort of beneficial in the risk context. But if it's being used to support ESG goals more broadly, as the commission has directed, I think we'd be supportive in that context, to see what we can do.
Thank you. I think that's an important point. So it makes sense that it capture the risks that are most important from what the risk assessment that the utility has conducted in its modeling. This particular screen that I'm looking at right now is titled, however, California Wildfires Social Vulnerability Index. So it looks like they've come up with an index that is targeted towards wildfire, at least in this particular screen.
Okay, I don't see any other hands up. Give it another second. Okay. Thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone who commented. We can now move on to the valuation of electric reliability, and I'll turn it over to Fred.
Thank you, Arnold. Is my sound coming through okay?
Yep.
Thanks, CJ, for running through the slides.
Actually, that's me, Fred. Sorry about that.
Okay. So our next section, talking about valuation of electric reliability. Just to repeat, we're referencing the scoping memo issue that all of these things are aimed at. Should the commission consider revising or refining RDF methodology for valuing services, mitigations, impacts, such as those related to reliability or safety? I basically paraphrase this to say, so should we revise or refine the valuation of reliability and should it be expressed in dollars? So next slide. Based on all the discussions that we've had and the comments received, I think these are some very solid reasons why we should revise electric reliability valuation. The natural units of customer minutes interrupted, or the related metric of SAIDI, don't have an equal value for different customer classes. And they have different impacts depending on outage duration. These are two very important aspects that have been brought out in our discussions. For example, the main customer classes would be things like residential customers versus commercial customers and industrial customers. The impact of minutes out of electric service can be very different amongst those categories. And that we found that longer outages have disproportionate consequences, not just linear with the number of minutes lost, but in some cases, perhaps a quadratic relationship might exist between the minutes out if you have a duration of a significant length of time, or other kinds of relationship that's nonlinear. Another reason is that the values expressed in risk scores and RSE numbers are difficult to interpret, which is parroting the same kinds of rationale that Arnold had already put forward in looking at risk scores and RSEs overall. Thank you. Next slide. So our recommendation will be to adopt the Lawrence Berkeley ICE estimator, because that estimator provides valuation in dollars. It accounts for the three main customer categories, and it does account for impacts of different outage durations. In most of the cases, we can say more about that in detail, but these are the general reasons why ICE is a not perfect, but it's a bronze solution that's available now. And adoption of the ICE model sets the groundwork for having a model or a standard established to value electric reliability. And that's all of my slides. And I'm certainly open and welcome to hearing everyone's commentary. Sam, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so we got that presentation from the fellow, who described the ICE model, and just looking at your accounts for impacts of different outage durations, he also said, I forget what words he used, but geographical scope, right? I think those two, we almost have to add that word in there. It isn't just how long it is, but it's the entire northeast of the United States, or it's the entire northern half of California. And he had words for that. He used those words together, duration and I don't know what it was. Right? Do you recall that?
Yeah, not off the top of my head, but I do know they allow regionalization. So the user of the ICE model can specify at least what right now they can say, well, we're in the state of California.
I think he used the word like widespread, right? A widespread power outage affects, an entire city is very different from tiny little pockets that lose power, right? And that fits in that same line, accounts for impacts of different outage durations, or widespreadness. It's not the word we want to use, but I just want to get that out there.
Okay, well,
yeah, Sam,
it's certainly a great point. I can confirm that that's part of the ICE model as well, to give us further rationale. And I may have cut somebody off there. Was there some additional comment?
Sound like Eric.
This is, yeah, thanks. I didn't know if you could hear me. Sam, yeah, it's basically dollar magnitude is represented by impact and duration for the most part, and its location. So circuit specificity, and then of course if it's a bigger set of circuits or a bigger up to substation or other or even further, but that then just covers more people, right? It considers the outage costs of more people. So
what do you want to use the word circuit specificity? Do you want to just add that in here? I think that would cover it.
Or location. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Location. I think that works.
Yeah.
My impression so far is that the user doesn't have the ability to specify those things, except that they can run the ICE model for a given set of circumstances. If they have a particular breakdown or a particular area or type of customer situation, you can run the ICE model with whatever inputs you want. You can run a subset of your entire system through it and get ICE data for that condition. If you have a particular outage you want to model that's like an 8-hour outage for, you know, all of your commercial customers, you can just put that data in the model and run it, and it gets you a cost for that event, if you will. So I think that is important to point out.
Well, arguably it's customer survey based. So the customers in this area are going to say their outage costs are different than another area, rural versus urban, et cetera. So that's going to be a distinction. And then moreover, the ICE model is typically only the survey data that supports it right now is not long duration. So if you said 8 hours, it's going to look the same as 8 1-hour durations because, I mean, the duration is not something that's dimensionally robust or well built out in the model. So that's part of what I thought was important about what I heard the utilities potentially want to do and would extend the ICE model. I think Brian Landry, not to put you on the spot if you're listening, but I think the utilities have their own outage analysis that they do. Some of them, certainly at Southern California Edison, and they can expand the survey database and get the information, the data to populate longer duration kind of analysis.
Yeah, so Dr. Work, that's a good point. I mean, I think just to add on to that, which is all correct. This is Brian from Edison. So you can do a lot of things with the ICE calculator, but I want to caution everyone that it's a very manual process. And every simulation, it's like add inputs, run, add inputs, run. So in theory, you know, we would have to be cautious about what level of iterations that we plan to run, how many circuits we plan to run this on, what's the different scenarios. And to that point, it's not really good for durations that are longer than 24 hours. So I would just want to temper expectations from the group about the utility of this tool as it is today.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And we're not trying to say it's the perfect solution by any means. We're saying it's the best standard model available right now. And I believe I just reviewed your own company's 2019 value of service study. And as Arnold was saying up front, we're not saying that these are the only ways to do things. If the utility has a better method with a good rationale, we wouldn't say you must use the ICE model. We're saying that the ICE model is a standard that's available to use.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. I appreciate that. Thank you, Fred.
And I think, is that CJ that has his hand up? CP?
It
Who's
looks
CP?
like Vincent and then Chris Parks.
Oh, Chris Parks. Sorry, Chris Parks.
So,
Is Vincent first?
Yeah,
yeah,
let's go
I
with
just
Vincent
wanted to
first.
point out a bit when you say adopt, want to kind of explore the practical feasibility of that, especially from PG&E, right? Brian alluded to ICE, you put in the stuff and you punch a number. Our risk model, as you know, is Monte Carlo based. We run tens of thousands of scenarios per risk, per tranche. So we could end up having essentially hundreds of thousands of scenarios, right? And I think that when I looked at the ICE PowerPoint, when they talked about the next generation ICE 2.0, they talked about some kind of API application program interface that is a way for our programs to talk to their program programmatically so that we don't have to key in 100,000 scenarios. But I don't think that is the case for the current ICE 1.0. So when you say adopt, is it basically like, get close to the ICE 1.0 results or something like that? Because, for us to literally adopt to literally use it right now, I think it's almost something impossible for us to do.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think what we were looking at is what we have now in terms of even just establishing an average value of customer minutes interrupted is really deficient because it doesn't account for different customer types, different outage durations. The ICE model at least does that. So I don't think we were anticipating that the utility would run, thousands of simulations through it. I think we're looking at it as more of a just kind of like the VSL would give you a number to plug in for the value of equivalent fatality. This would give you a number to plug in for the average value of a customer minute interrupted. With granted, it has a lot of limitations, but it's better than not taking any account of the different customer classes and the different outage durations.
So perhaps something like, we would model reliability and then check with the ICE and see if they're kind of consistent for certain cases and things like that.
That sounds like a very interesting proposal as a way of using it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We got some hands. Are you keeping track? Is Chris Parks our next?
Yeah, it's Chris, then Max, and then Sam.
Yeah, so regarding the ICE estimator, what I recall from the earlier technical working group meeting on this was the expert from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and maybe, did we hear from Dr. Michael Wera at some point? But talking about some of the limitations of it, in what I had kind of understood coming out of that was, should the ICE model be used in the ramp analysis? And we supported the ICE model should be used in the ramp analysis because one of the benefits of it is that at least it gives us kind of like a ballpark number in terms of the impact cost on customers. Like Dr. Michael Wara for 2019 PSPS events in Northern California used that tool to come up with a number on the order of $10 billion. That's my recollection from what he put in testimony before Congress. But at least that gave us some kind of concept of the cost to ratepayers of, for example, PSPS events. So having the LBL ICE estimator as a tool to supplement an analysis by a utility to understand the risk makes a lot of sense because at least it gives kind of like a backstop or or like a reality check in terms of what does it come up with in terms of the cost for customers. What I also understood from the technical working group is that there are limitations, and I think Brian mentioned one of them, and I think the LBL and maybe others mentioned, you know, that it doesn't deal with outages longer than 24 hours. And there's other ones that it may not be as useful on a granular basis. I don't know all of its limitations because I'm not, you know, really in depth familiar with the tool. However, it does make sense that it be part of the bronze solution because it at least provides another source of information to evaluate everything else that a utility, I believe, still needs to do. So, for example, if we go back to the previous slide, let's see, or I'm sorry, to the next slide. Oh no, I'm sorry, back, I got mixed up. Yeah, so this slide highlights some of the issues trying to come up with a standard number for CMI, customer minutes interrupted. Longer durations, I think Fred was mentioning, you know, this is not linear. Longer outages have a greater consequences, which makes more sense. I mean, folks may be dependent upon systems to keep their medicines cold and stuff like that. And then there's, you know, whether they have access to water, if it's pumped, you know, and it can affect utilities and other communications and all kinds of stuff. So the longer the outage can really, you can have an exponential curve in terms of the cost to customers. And so that needs to be captured. I think the other factor that we've highlighted is the frequency. You know, some customers are getting PSPS events at a greater rate than other customers. Those kind of drive the need for having this at a granular locational level, which I think other parties, I think Eric was just mentioning it and others, about being able to talk about very specific circuit level communities evaluation. That needs to be part of a utilities analysis, because if this is all going to be used to drive mitigation programs, like where are they going to target, where they're going to alleviate the need to do PSPS with a set of customers, it needs to be at that granular level. Otherwise, it's not efficient. It could be addressing some average number of customer minutes interrupted and not targeting the customers that are at the extremes of those. So this, I think, still needs to be done. And it sounds like some utilities may be doing some of that. And at the same time, it doesn't mean that we should not still use the ICE model, because the ICE model, not to substitute for it, but to supplement what the utilities are doing, because it also provides another reality check. Well, what does the ICE model say in terms of customer cost? And so that's the response to what this proposal is saying. I think it needs to be included, but it should not in any way preclude or stop utilities from doing the other analyses that they must do to really target and prioritize mitigations.
Max and then Sam.
Thanks. I think Vincent had expressed the concern that, you know, they might want to do Monte Carlo simulation using the model, treating uncertainties about various parameters. And I just wanted to point out that the ICE model is actually available in downloadable spreadsheets. So, you know, if you want to use it and then modify it to take Monte Carlo inputs, you know, I think technically that would be relatively easy to do. And, you know, the underlying models, although they're regressions fitted to, you know, a fair amount of data on different classes of user and attitudes as a function of outage time, the models are fairly simple regressions. They do have quadratic terms, you know, to reflect that longer outages are, you know, proportionately worse than short outages and so on. But you know, it'd be relatively simple to incorporate it, for example, in an existing spreadsheet or other model if you wanted to do that. I guess I also have a question for the utilities about to what extent do you have existing models that have, for example, nonlinear terms as a function of outage length, and what classes of customer types do the models apply to? Tell me if I'm out of bounds in asking this question at this moment, but I am a little bit curious, how your models either existing compare with what ICE does, which admittedly is certainly quite limited relative to what we would like to see.
Good points. Do we want to go forward with the rest of the current set of questions and then give opportunity for answers to Max's question? Maybe we go with Sam next.
Thanks. And I do think Max raises an interesting question here, but I want to, Vincent talked about, well, this thing doesn't have an application interface yet. And I see another way to use this model. To quote the statistician George Box, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. There is an approach that we could apply in many places during this entire proceeding here, called a surrogate model. Here's how it would apply to ICE. I don't know the details of ICE. Suppose ICE had 3 input parameters, and I'm really talking to Vincent here to think about this, right? We have 3 input parameters, and they can take on any values at all. Well, imagine that we make a table that for each of the 3 parameters, it gives it 3 values, and that's like 27 numbers. So we make it a much cruder model, but then we all use that table, and you can embed that table in your Monte Carlo. I mean, I've seen this used in the case of modeling aircraft engines on C5s with incredibly complicated simulations that they then reduce to some much simpler set of equations that they can use in another setting. And the term is surrogate model, which kind of sucks the soul out of the ICE model in a crude way so that we can use it in other places.
Yes, thanks, Max and Sam, for pointing out those points. Max, thank you very much for mentioning it. I think your comments tie directly with what Sam was saying. And, I think those things that you mentioned are definitely worthy considerations. Just want to make sure that those kind of things are kind of meet the spirit of what SPD is proposing when they say use ICE. I think it does. So.
Was that all the hands raised? Do we want to offer an opportunity for utilities to comment on Max's questions about the degree that they're able to model at this point themselves?
I have a limited knowledge of the work that we've done, but the study that I'm aware of is one that we did. Actually, I think Yumi did it back in 2012, and I believe it was by customer class. I don't know if it got into geographical locations, so it's a bit dated, and I doubt it would have any more resolution than ICE.
Thanks.
This is Eric Wojciech, if I can just jump in real quick. I think Chris and others have made the point very, very well that we need this information, we need this data, and we ideally need more granularity to the circuit level. And I would only emphasize that in all my work on energy and distribution, transmission, reliability, economic expansion, pricing, it's so important, and it's so important for this work as well. So I just hope we can encourage and get support in the regulatory process for funding of these studies, and that they could be extended to be more useful for PSPS and longer duration outages. One of the things that worried me, and you other people already heard it, I guess, that LBL's approach is so general. It doesn't, have a big database. It doesn't use a lot of survey points. It's crude, and so it's the only starting point we have, really. But I hope we can extend it, because it will be really, really useful and important. And moreover, the utilities, as we go forward with what I see as versions of transactive energy and more distributed energy resource integration, we're going to need it in a number of situations, and the safety proceeding is just one of them. So I'll stop. Thanks.
Oh, we have a hand up from Sam.
So Max and I were having a discussion over lunch that I want to bring up in this context. And there's the word risk attitude. We use the word risk attitude. We use the word nonlinear consequence. These all kind of relate to the same thing, modeling preferences. And in decision analysis, what they do is they say, what would you prefer? An hour of outage or a stick in the eye? And I'd rather like the hour of outage. How about 8 hours of outage? Oh, then I'll take the stick in the eye. If you could map that out for every possible choice you had in life, you would have someone's complete risk attitude. Now, layering something that we're calling risk attitude on top of that, let's sort of ignore that for now. What we're doing here is a very specific case where every minute of outage is not of equal disutility for me. And we must address this issue. But this is where the scaling, the nonlinear scaling of MAVF actually gets baked in. And you may not need to. Max and I are both worried that anything we say on this matter is going to make everyone more confused rather than less. But you don't need, you certainly, I think, need to bake in that a long outage is worse than a short outage, and a widespread outage is worse than a localized outage. And that William mentioned earlier in the day, these monetization functions can be nonlinear. They can have step functions in them, like all kinds of stuff. Once you have that, then you've got the dollars. And I think for the most part, if you've done that reliability modeling and the cost of the outage, the monetization of the outage correctly, then risk attitude really does become linear. It's just dollars, typically. I don't think it's always the case. And the other thing that impinges on this is the ALARP approach of like things that are really unacceptable. And as I mentioned, from a mathematician's point of view, that's just where your preference function took a vertical jump. But I do believe that is something that does need to be roped in terms of some things that are just absolutely unacceptable. Having another Fukushima, but in California, is just so unacceptable. We don't even want to. We're going to take care of that problem before we talk about RSE. I can picture that. So I'm just saying that we can stop using risk attitude maybe altogether if we get each of these penalty functions right, these things. So it is very central to what we're doing.
Pardon me, this Eric, if I would say, I think this is maybe the most central feature because it really does pin down where you want to spend money, for what, where, for which customers, when.
Okay, Joe Ito has his hand raised, and then Vincent.
Hello, I joined a little bit late. I found out about this workshop topic late. I'm here to be on for a little bit if I can answer any technical questions about the ICE calculator. I did want to make a correction to a statement that Eric made. The ICE calculator is based on 37 distinct customer loss of load surveys conducted by 10 utilities over a 25-year period. To our knowledge, it's the largest set of customer studies that have been, it's a major fraction of the studies that have ever been conducted. And collectively, there are over 100,000 survey responses that were used to generate the equations that are in the ICE calculator. And those equations can be accessed directly through the spreadsheet that Max described, which can all be downloaded from the ICE calculator webpage. Thank you.
And this is Sam. I have a quick question for Joe. So Joe, I don't know if you were on when I was asking the question. We know these models are nonlinear in duration, but are they should be nonlinear in widespreadness was the word I used, but like, right? One square mile contiguous is, you know, not nearly as bad as like 10 contiguous square miles, but it's more complicated than that as you take out hospitals and whatever. But how does the model address spatial correlation? Let me just call it spatial correlation.
So I'll give you two answers. In my research, absolutely. Our work is, a lot of our focus is about the multiplicative impacts of wider spread and longer duration interruptions. But to your specific question, the ICE calculator does not take any explicit account of the geographic scope of a power interruption, because again, it's based on regression equations developed from survey responses of individual customers talking about the individual costs that they directly experience when their power goes out. And that's by the formulation of the survey instruments themselves. And some of the impacts that you're talking about are ones that would be impacts potentially on customers whose powers are not interrupted, but whose businesses might be affected by other customers whose power has been interrupted. And so that would never be something you could capture directly in a survey of customers whose powers has been interrupted. I hope that's a start on addressing your question, Sam.
That's very interesting. But the outages we know about are, at least you have them tabulated somewhere so you could find out how widespread they were, presumably after the fact, and maybe do another regression on that. I don't know. Is that a possibility?
Well, the surveys themselves are of hypothetical interruptions that customers would experience. So they're asked a battery of questions about what would be the impact on their business if your business lost power for an hour on a hot summer afternoon. The ICE calculator is not based on empirical studies of the actual costs that customers have experienced from specific power interruptions.
Got it. Got it. Well, I would argue that's something else we have to be worried about.
So, Joe, this is Eric. I was talking in part about, and it just came up, the lack of locational differentiation. Do you expect that the LBL ICE calculator is going to move to be more specific? You may not know it. I used to live in the Oakland Hills, close to you. I now live in Lake County, population 65,000. Instead of Alameda County, population 2 million or about that, something very large. So when you try to apply your ICE calculations to me now, they're irrelevant almost. And my PSPS number of events is way higher than it is in Alameda County. So we're looking for PSPS and geographic detail. How can you help us?
Eric, I can't help you with the present ICE calculator. We did not have information on the location of the customers whose survey responses were being analyzed to develop the equations that are currently in the calculator. In the update that we're launching this summer, we will be looking at exactly those kinds of questions with the new surveys that we'll be administering. But we won't have that information for at least another year and a half while these surveys are being executed.
Chris, did you have a question for Joe or?
Yeah, for Joe, I'm glad he's here. So he answered one of the questions which I had, which had to do with locational. It sounds like that's going to be a element of the next one that starts and won't be available for maybe a year or two or something. But the other question was what I heard previously about not being set up to do outages greater than 24 hours. Is that the case with the current tool, Joe? And will that be changed in the new tool?
Let me go back to the locational one first. In the analysis that we did do of the original survey responses, we did not find statistically significant differences that would allow us to suggest a regional variation in cost. Some of that's based on the surveys that it's all based on the surveys that we actually had, and the type of geographic differentiation that was there. A lot of the companies whose surveys we analyzed were on the West Coast. To your other question, the surveys that are relied on by the ICE calculator, none of them asked questions of customers about interruptions lasting longer than 16 and 24 hours. And that's why we do not recommend using the ICE calculator to estimate the cost of power interruptions lasting longer than 24 hours. Our work suggests, and I think our intuition would tell us, that interruptions that last longer than 24 hours are likely to cost customers more than interruptions that last 24 hours. The issue is how much more. So the 24-hour number has been used as a starting point. We've seen work that's been done by some of the folks that we work with in developing the ICE calculator, in which they apply a multiplier to the 24-hour value to look at longer interruptions, a multiplier of greater than 1. The update to the ICE calculator is also similarly not going to focus on interruptions longer than 24 hours. Again, when we get into these longer duration interruptions, there are these multiplier effects that I described earlier. There are also typically, it's very difficult to ask customers these questions unless they've actually been through a long duration interruption. And so, and in addition, so there's a lot of, whereas most people have experienced shorter duration interruptions, they know what the cost impacts might be. The second complication is that often with longer duration interruptions, there are a number of assumptions that you have to make. You have to build more of a scenario around what is the interruption milieu that's taking place. And because many of these long interruptions are associated with natural disasters, things like mobility, cell service, impacts on other infrastructures as an example, are material to the cost that customers experience. And then you get into the challenges of how do you parse that to being without electric service, as opposed to being able to drive to somewhere that has electric service. So it's a lot more complicated. In terms of the update to the ICE calculator, we are focusing principally on the shorter duration, 24 hours or less, for that update, because we think customers can respond to that information reliably. But I think, as I've also indicated, we have a lot of research going on at our lab to try to look at longer duration, wider spread pattern eruptions. We're using other kinds of methodologies that would build on survey approaches.
Arnold, may I ask a couple follow-up questions on that? Okay. So Joe, regarding the locational information, is that something that a utility can apply to circuit level and pockets of customers who meet certain kind of extremes using the ICE calculator, or is it precluded? The ICE calculator is not useful for that.
There are a number of side variables that can be entered into the equations of the ICE calculator. Some of which, if you can do correlations with geographic location, could be used. For example, one of the there's a couple of things that get used, like average customer energy consumption. And when people use the ICE calculator in different states, we introduce the average consumption numbers that come out of the EIA data as a default for that state. But you can override those. In fact, all these variables can be overridden with direct entry of variables that are more specific to the populations that you're examining.
So the kind of example that we've talked about earlier in technical working group meetings is, for example, Rincon Valley used to get PSPS for any type of PSPS event. The local entity said that they were almost always PSPS. Is the ICE calculator able to be used at that circuit level of figuring out where is that happening and then targeting mitigations towards those pockets of customers?
The calculator itself can be applied to any geographic scope of granularity by adjusting the number of customers and the customers by customer class for the study that's being conducted using the ICE calculator. And so in terms of the relative populations, circuit-specific analysis is often done by utilities that are using the ICE calculator in distribution planning activities.
Okay.
What I'd like to just to make like to make a comment though with regard to PSPS. The surveys that were used to build the ICE calculator and never asked questions about multiple interruptions. They would ask about single scenarios of interruptions of a given length. And again, these would be asking these banks of different scenarios that the customer is being presented with. And to my knowledge, none of them were about repeated scenarios. There are some of the surveys that were used do ask about advanced notification. And that is one of the sort of coefficients that can be entered into the ICE calculator equations that adjust the costs that come out. And so, but the nature of the advanced notification was specific to that, which was represented in those questionnaires that were used. And so again, there's some translation involved in the way advanced notification for example, a PSPS event might have been called that would need to be, just be aware of.
Thank you. So you answered the questions that I had. Thank you. I would just add, so to close out our comments or our feedback or suggestions at this workshop is that we believe that it's necessary to capture the frequency, the ones that have the longest outages, to have that utilities need to evaluate that so it can be targeting mitigations at the circuit level. And in terms of understanding the data, we mentioned before that what I learned from Joe, I think, is that there's a set of questions that are asked in surveys that may not include and probably doesn't include all of the impacts that a customer experiences from an outage. So we recommended in the past that claims data can be used to at least see what the customers are saying, how they are impacted by outages, whether they're long duration PSPS ones, or maybe now, some utilities are using no notification outages that may reduce ignitions because of a circuit disturbance detection. All of those impacts should be understood and be able to be factored in terms of understanding the risk and impacts on customers. So I guess as far as we're concerned, we think that it's a very useful tool. However, it shouldn't preclude or prevent or substitute for the utilities doing the analysis that they can get the data on in terms of how they impact customers.
Sam, were you going to reply to Chris? Or
well, I want to say something else that I think this does not take into account that we should maybe be thinking about, which is in the area of, if you look at at anti-terrorist activity. People are looking at protecting the power grid from terrorists, right? The terrorists, unlike windstorms and fires, are intelligent adversaries. And what a terrorist is going to do is say, oh my goodness, I can take out these 3 transformers and black out the Los Angeles basin because I've worked it through and I know the circuitry. And there are such things. And in operations research, they talk about these as a minimal cut set. What is the minimum set of things I would have to take out to black out Los Angeles? And they're going to go for those. The windstorms are not. But I think we need to be aware of those. Again, it's a spatial thing. No customer survey is going to tell you this, but someone who runs the electric circuits in a region is going to know those vulnerabilities. They're not going to want to publish the locations. Please don't do that, or the terrorists will hit them. But in internal risk management, I think we need to be taking this into account, that this set of assets forms what is known as a minimal cut set. That is actually what mathematicians call it. And those require, it's so bad when those go out, right? Because of the spatial, because they wipe out a whole bunch of other circuits, that we need to pay attention to those. I haven't heard that discussed here or anywhere else, and I'm just bringing it up because I'm going to bring it up again at some point.
This, Eric, I appreciate the point. It's certainly been discussed for a long time in the literature on security for grid constraints and grid construction and management. Seems critical. Thanks.
Okay, Vincent has his hand raised.
I just had a clarifying question for Sam. I wasn't able to clearly hear what you were saying earlier. You mentioned something about, let me see, you mentioned something about penalty functions and risk attitude and something being linear, and I was not sure I caught all of it.
All right. So we use the word risk attitude, and we use the word scaling function, and we sort of throw them all around. The most basic principle is, for any 2 things that could happen to you, I can say to you, Vincent, which one would you prefer, right? And if I could do that for all the infinite things I could present for you, that's all I'd ever have to know about your risk preference, right? Because risk attitude is used in finance often to say, well, it would be 10 times worse for me to lose $1 million than to lose 100. No, it would be 50 times worse for me to lose $1 million than to lose $100, right? That I have a nonlinear risk attitude, and that's true, right? But we don't. If we model the penalty of outage properly, where suppose an 8-hour outage is 10 times as bad as a 4-hour outage or a 1-hour outage, if we get that correct and can monetize that correctly, then we don't really need to layer a risk attitude on top of that monetization. The nonlinearity is trapped in the penalty function. And this reflects what William said this morning about that penalty function could have step functions in it, nonlinearity. It is what it is. And if we get that part right, then risk attitude, where I think risk attitude still really shows up is some of these forbidden things that ALARP talks about. There's just some things if this could even happen, we can't even talk about anything else until we get it fixed, right? I mean, I think that's a reasonable thing to feel. We don't have time to do analysis here because, the elephants are charging or something.
And penalty function is also scaling function is what you mean by penalty function.
Yeah. That's right. if the 8-hour outage, if the outage penalty goes up non-linearly, that's just a scaling function, right? By having too many different words for these things, we think there are too many different things. There's actually one thing. It's, would you rather have an 8-hour outage or a stick in the eye, right? I mean, that's the one concept, your preference over one thing over another. And that turns out to be quite nonlinear when you get into it. But we need some kind of surrogate for our decision-making purposes that captures the basis of this without getting into too much detail.
Okay, thank you.
See Max with his hand up. Was there somebody else, Arnold?
I do not see anyone but Max with his. So Max, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Sam's comment. So the nonlinear scaling functions that are in the current Mabf framework are used really in two different ways, potentially. One is to deal with nonlinear values, for example, for outages, that as Sam has talked about, and the other is for a risk attitude to, for example, to signal risk aversion. And those are really two different things that you can use those nonlinear scaling functions for. And with the cost-benefit framework, as Sam says, there may still be nonlinear functions you want to apply to some of the natural units, as in outages. But we shouldn't think of that as a risk attitude. It's just, 8-hour outages is more than twice as bad as a 4-hour outage. It's not a risk attitude, it's just the attitudes on how bad things are. The risk attitude is, preferably represented as a separate thing. And in the cost-benefit framework, one can consider applying a risk attitude function to the overall monetary benefit, monetary cost after you've added it up. And that's why you would just be reflecting, an aversion to, large bad outcomes are worse, than small ones for the same amount of dollars. So anyway, I do think it might be useful to have a separate session just talking about risk attitude, but what we're talking about here on electric reliability and valuation of different outage lengths is not really about risk attitude. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I kind of agree that there are two different concepts. I think Sam and yourself pointed it out really well earlier on in one of the first meetings that we have. But as you know, the Salmon as it is doesn't have the kind of classical MAVF framework where you have the nonlinear first and then you have an overall utility function on top of that. And that's why I think we're kind of mashing the two together.
Exactly.
But if you capture the nonlinearity of the economic cost of the longer outages, right? As Max has pointed out, at the higher level, it's very likely to be linear, but it's sure not linear at that lower level. And you have to be very careful how you aggregate these nonlinearities up. I mean, when would it be nonlinear? In PG&E's case, they've had some bankruptcies. And I believe if something is going to bankrupt your company, then that forces some sort of nonlinearity perhaps into your risk attitude. I also want to point out that all of these penalty functions, not all of them, some of them may need to be applied at the portfolio level, and don't forget that, because if I have what's known as the minimal cut set, it turns out that if I were a terrorist, here are the 3 transformers I would blow up to black out a city, right? Well, if for some reason a common windstorm is likely to take these out simultaneously, I'm not going to see that at the tranche level. I won't see that until I roll it up properly. And so in an ideal world, we would roll up all the uncertainty and all the potential risks, but then apply the penalty function at the very top. You know, after we've learned, oh my God, there's a 20% chance that these 3 transformers would get knocked out even without terrorists knowing where they are.
Max and then Brian. Oh,
Excuse me, I accidentally left my hand up. Thanks,
okay, thank you. Brian Landry.
Yeah, I think Dr. Savage has a good point. So the analogy I was thinking of, you know, after a point in time, and this is a very simplistic view, but if your power's out for maybe 1 or 2 hours, maybe the ice cream in your freezer doesn't melt, but maybe after a few hours it melts, but then after a point in time, there's no more ice cream to melt. So what I mean is that there is a non-linearity to sort of these loss functions over time. And I think it's an important point that we should not take lightly, especially for outages over 24 hours.
Like after that loss is suffered, you don't continue to suffer that loss at the same level. If your ice cream is gone, it's gone, and it's no worse 6 hours later than it was 2 hours after it first melted.
But what's interesting there is that's an interesting, really interesting example, Brian, because remember the old convex and concave scaling functions. That is what we're talking about here. And the one you just talked about is actually, I think that's a concave one that after the ice cream is melted, you're not worried, right? A convex one is, you know, then all your food goes bad, then the food spoils the refrigerator, you know, then people start dying in the hospitals. That's the convex one. Convex means the worse it gets, the worse it gets. Concave means, you know, the example I use is 1 inch of raw sewage on your floor is really, you know, no worse than a half an inch of raw sewage on your floor. As soon as you have raw sewage on your floor, you got sewage on your floor. And these could go in different directions, as you point out. It could, not only nonlinear, it might be convex and concave, and for the important ones, we need to model these.
That's right. So I think the point that Vince mentioned, early on in the meeting is that I know it seems like maybe something we can work on later, but the concept of risk attitude really matters if we go beyond events that are 24 hours. And this is just one example. And I know it's a very whimsical example of ice cream melting, but hopefully that resonated a little bit with the team.
Okay, are there any other comments on the valuation of electric reliability? I'm not seeing any hands. Let me see what time it is. Let's just take a 10-minute break and meet back here at 2:28, or we should just meet back here at 2:30, and then we'll finish up with the remaining section. All right, it's 2:30. Hope everyone is back from break. Most importantly, Fred.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great. So I'm going to back up to your the evaluation of gas reliability, and we'll get started right away.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Arnold. We'll jump right in. We have similar reasons with valuation of gas reliability as we had discussed for electric. So moving on, what is our discussion about gas reliability? We should express gas reliability in dollars, but we don't have a convenient model really developed or established as yet for doing this kind of conversion. Fortunately, gas reliability has been a small component of ramp scores and has really not come under serious critique or concern in the way it's been valued, even by looking at the implied value. So for the time being, we are recommending that as a plug-in or placeholder, that IOUs look at their implied value from their most recent ramp MAVF calculations and plug that in as a dollar value for gas reliability. Granted, this is not a perfect situation, but for the reasons I said before, we're recommending this could be used as a placeholder until a better valuation technique can be developed. And that's it.
Comments or questions or concerns from anybody?
Hi, Fred. This is Greg Flores from SoCal Gas. I don't have any particular reaction at this point in time. I'd like to, philosophically, I see where we're going with this, as a placeholder. So I don't have a lot of, opposition to that, but I just want to take a step back and better understand it, utilizing our recent ramp information and see whether or not, is it better than what we have? And then in the meantime, strive towards a more accurate model.
I would be delighted if you can come back to us with some actual data from your own studies, from your own analysis of what gas outages, what kind of cost impacts they've had. If you can give us some of that information or take a look, see what you have. I would be the first one to be very happy to replace this. Again, we can fall back to Arnold's position at the very beginning where we're not binding utilities to use these if they can provide rationale for using something that's more accurate.
Yeah, sorry for that. Very fair. I agree with that approach.
Thank you. Vincent has a hand up.
Yeah, a couple of points. One is related to this topic, and another one was basically a little continuation of the previous discussion, but I'll talk a little bit on this one first, and then you can see whether you want me to talk about the previous discussion. But as far as gas reliability should be expressed in dollars, I think that worthwhile. But I think kind of echo Sampra's experience. When we reach out to our gas teams for them for advice on how to do that, they are like, we were looking towards you guys, ERM, maybe you can tell us how to do it as well. So I think it's a real kind of work in progress. And we might take a few times to get it right because, you know, there's just so many things to consider.
Yeah, I
But given
appreciate
what you
that.
said earlier about, you know, this is along the lines of recommendations and things like that. That, you know, I think that's helpful to know.
Hi, this is Eric Wojcik. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Eric.
Yes, thanks. Well, one of the thoughts that I have is that as I look at gas service and think about the electric component or the electric side of value service and try to apply it, it looks to me like one of the most valuable things right now obviously would be for gas supply. If we differentiate it to the ramping generation that SoCalGas is supplying, wow, okay, that's pretty important, and that would get a really high score. I don't know how to then though take that to smaller segments. So then you're going to look at the outage costs of, let's say, somebody that's using natural gas to, I don't know, manufacture some kinds of plastic molding and I don't know, stereo equipment or something like that. A whole bunch of that is offshore now, but that's the sort of small, or intermediate business commercial case. When you get to residential, I don't know what gas reliability means, except you need hot water and you need food cooking. And it starts to change very radically. So I'm wondering if when we go to this, what's the basic template look like? What's the ICE version of this look like for different customer groups? And it's really hard for me to imagine how it looks like actually. And I think I should know this intuitively. So just a thought that I think it's going to be a bit of a tough road to really define the gas value service by customer group for durations and well, especially in locations. So the comparable version that we're working on in electric here on the gas side looks pretty much not crazy difficult, but not easy. Anybody else? Does SoCalGas or someone, PG&E, want to comment?
Yeah, Vincent has his hand up.
Oh, it was on my second
Oh.
question, but you know, I kind of agree with what Eric's saying, right? That's why initially when we reached out to our gas teams, I think they were kind of you know, they didn't have the pieces to put this all together as well. So I don't have an answer. I just know that it's a pressing problem for this work we're trying to do here.
Yeah, my stopgap suggestion is that, you know, we would do no worse than we are where we are currently to simply adopt what was calculated using MAVF, even though other aspects have been shown to have, you know, some concern about their reasonableness. If we have nothing else to go on, and those values have not been subject to much criticism in the past, it's something we can plug in. There is a hand up from Max.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out in this connection that at least if you have linear scaling functions, which all except PG&E are currently using, you can set the numbers in the cost-benefit framework so that it will give you identical results to the numbers that you're currently getting from the MAVF. So that mathematically, you could make them equivalent. I don't know if you would want to, but you can do it that way. So so in that sense, it's not a big leap. It's more a question of how you want to think about it and how you want to estimate the parameters of the function. But mathematically, it can be equivalent, again, with the proviso that you're using linear scaling functions in the MAVF. I don't know, is that helpful?
Yeah, I think it supports my basic proposal.
Good.
This is Greg Flourishing again. Yeah, I agree with Max. I mean, it's doable. I also agree with Eric in that, beyond like our wholesale customers, for example, and the energy producers, I'm not sure how we stratify that population and get equivalencies on a dollar basis. So, I think it's a good notion, a good thought. It's just something that requires additional study. And to me, ultimately, it's like, will we be better off by doing this than what we currently do?
Right. Is the study effort going to be worth what we find? Yeah, that's.
Or do we end up in the same place, right? So it's a head scratcher.
Yeah, thank you.
Pardon me, this Eric. I mean, I think we'll be better off because the value of service is the natural driver, and it's the only correct way to think about this. That sounds pretty high-minded, but in terms of capital investment for a utility or any large-scale structure, you have to build to the value of what it is that you're providing, and that marginal value service should equal marginal cost of service in the old-fashioned scheme, electric or gas, for the entire system to the minute level and aggregated up to the large-scale levels and differentiated. So I think it would give us a lot of insight, actually, and it would probably and maybe change how we use this risk-based system very significantly. And it would change how we see MAVF from my view. So, but I'm just trying to say that the theory should be right. It is been always right before. And now this is a chance to bring data and information to the theory and go farther than we can go otherwise. Thanks.
Thanks. We had a hand up from Chris.
Yeah, thanks. So on this slide 30, it talks about using implied dollar value of gas reliability. So I'm not sure if that, and I'll confess that we've been mainly focused on wildfire. We just haven't been able to get involved with the gas aspects of the RAMs or the general rate cases. However, if the RAMs are, or the utilities are proposing to put a fixed dollar value for like a minute of outage of gas, then I would be concerned about that. If they are expected to analyze the risk and consequences and impacts on customers, like we've been discussing earlier, then that would make a lot of sense. So, and just to highlight a couple examples. So, was it 2015, I think, Discovery Bay had a gas outage right on some of the coldest days of the year. And it took an army of gas service reps, I think, to then go out and have to go through the process of relighting everyone's service and stuff. And I don't know exactly how long that outage lasted. And I can also imagine that there's locational aspects to risk. So, Sierra communities up in the Sierra, if they were to lose gas, may have a greater risk. If we think about like the Texas event where there was outage of a lot of facilities and things froze over and a lot of damage, then that would be a significant impact on customers if there were areas and pockets of customers in California that had the same kind of vulnerability. So it makes sense to me that the utility analysis should not boil down to trying to put a dollar figure on a minute outage of gas to try to then use that to drive mitigation programs. They should conduct an analysis similar to what we've been suggesting for electric, that it's locational, it's customer specific and vulnerability and that kind of stuff. And that should then drive the mitigation programs that come out of gas reliability. And I don't know whether gas reliability would include, like, I think it was back in 1994 in Alameda Island, because of their low pressure system and in a surge in pressure, there was, ignitions inside of homes. There could have been fires and stuff. And I think that happened in Boston more recently. Maybe it was 2018, something similar. I don't know if those come under the auspices of gas reliability, but if they do, those are examples of where you wouldn't want to just base it on some dollar figure per minute. It needs to be locational, dependent upon the vulnerability of the infrastructure at the location, the temperatures, the environment, that sort of thing. So to the extent that, utilities are expected to analyze their risk, understand and look at the greatest risk, the greatest impacts, and develop programs around that, it would make most sense to me, not for a utility to try to say, well, we're going to use this dollar figure that we've come out of the risk OIR with, and that's going to be driving us in terms of prioritizing mitigation programs and stuff. I think it needs to be granular, locational, and risk dependent, customer dependent. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris.
Let's go to Sam and then Greg.
So it seems to me that, well, first of all, that thing in Boston was a safety. I think that would fall under safety, not
I agree.
People got killed. But a long time ago, there was some discussion of, can't we just be using Google to search for lawsuits by people who didn't have power, didn't have gas? And we don't use what they've actually been awarded, of course, but does that give us like a way to triangulate whatever we're doing, right? Some kind of outside view of the economics of not having gas or electricity just through publicly available litigation records.
Greg and
Greg next.
Yeah, I appreciate the thoughts, Sam, but then I do become concerned then for the other attribute of safety, particularly for a fatality. I mean, the damage awards associated with fatality claims are I don't think there's any direct correlation to risk assessment there, as opposed to the value of a statistical life. So that would concern me. That would creep into.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you couldn't just read the numbers off and put them in your model. I don't mean that at all. I'm just saying they might inform us on this somehow.
Okay, fair enough. And then back to the dollar, assigning a dollar value to gas reliability. I then become, maybe I don't have this concern because I'm SoCal gas only now, but for our combo utilities, how do you do cross commodity prioritization when you have much more science behind reliability for the electric commodity as opposed to kind of right now our best guess for gas? So that's going to be an issue in terms of quality of analysis, I'll call it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking me, I have no idea. I mean, good question.
No, that was just yeah, no, not necessarily for you, doctor, but for everyone.
Yeah.
Any other comments? Chris?
Just to kind of line up with what I think Greg, was it Greg who was just mentioning that in terms of like customers, it makes sense to me too, that if you have electric generation that's depending upon gas, that the loss of gas to that customer who's also providing electric reliability should have a higher weighting in terms of risk analysis. So if that's what he was referring to, that makes sense to me.
If it was a distribution mitigation and you're talking about your last $10 million of resources, and you have a electric reliability project and a gas reliability project, given that you're a combo utility, how would this inform that decision to allocate? Given that the gas reliability depth of analysis isn't as deep as the electric analysis. If, obviously this needs to be risk informed, and there's many other considerations other than just the MAVF output. But it's just something I think about. And what we struggle with is on gas reliability. I mean, it's kind of the essence of this discussion.
So, this is Eric, Greg. I mean, the analysis and the fact that there's not a lot of data yet on gas reliability, to me, doesn't seem daunting at all, in that you're going to go and do the same kind of work. I mean, ideally, you'd go to a set of key customers in locations. Well, do all the statistics to make sure you do that well and in a robust way statistically. But it's a survey and or interview kind of analysis to try to figure out what their outage costs are. And when you don't have gas service, you're going to have outage costs. How far does it go? Well, in a duration, as the duration gets longer, it gets worse. So I think the analysis can be done, and it can be done in a relatively simple way, not with great depth initially. There's no reason to think, this should be an extensive over the top effort in a first round, but I certainly think it can be done, and it would be pretty standard practice to follow the electric side model to do it.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I understand what you're saying, Eric. So, I think really to sum it up, I mean, Fred has a proposal on the table. I think that we need to take a step back and study it and see if we have other alternatives in which to approach, and then we'll present them. And we'll just, and then probably an opportunity to work with PG and E as well and see, what their approaches is, and maybe we can come up with some agreed to approach, however we decide to do this.
Greg?
Anyone
More
else?
hands there, Arnold?
I don't see any, unless, Craig, you have another comment?
Nope, sorry, I'll take it down.
Thank you. So yeah, I don't see any other comments. And again, you'll just have to submit something in writing or email us or contact us directly if you do come up with additional thoughts on this. That pretty much concludes the initial draft set of recommendations that staff had for the group. I will say, let me just be clear. So with the extended deadline, and I've said that we have a very short time period to work with at this point. I'd like to offer the group July 8th for, that's a Friday, July 8th, for written comments to be submitted, and that's a week and a day, or a week and 2 days from today to submit written comments. If that it's okay with the group, I don't think we can, I know we can't push it any further than that. So yeah, so please, if you do have written comments to submit them July 8th. And I would like to stress some of, Eric's already kind of made some of these points, but we're striving to make the RDF better. And we know that it's not going to be perfect in the first attempt or going to the conclusion of phase 2. But we have plenty of opportunities, and we're going to discuss that going further. We have certain priorities we want to work on latter part of this year, starting in the latter part of this year. That we'll touch upon many of the issues raised here today and improve the methodology. We think that will go along with monetization. So we just wanted to let you know that, yeah, this is always a continual process of improvement. And perhaps think about, if we were to implement monetization and the valuation of safety and reliability, is that going to get us to a better place than we were compared to the status quo? With that, any other thoughts or comments? Okay, I will hang on for a bit. Hopefully, and I'll ask Fred and CJ to hang on for like about 10 more minutes. And otherwise, if you have no other questions, you may leave. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tyrone.
Thanks, William.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.